Good evening. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's in Hove. Do have a look at chapters 13 and 14 of the first book of Samuel, which are an account of the Philistine wars that King Saul wages in the early part of his reign. It's a very confusing and badly cast narrative. There's no real narrative line. There are quite a few very interesting things that occur in it, but they're almost by the way. For example, we meet Jonathan. So suddenly Jonathan appears, who is Saul's son, and he's obviously grown up as he takes part in the battle. And in fact, he wins a battle. One of the things that's interesting is that, for example, at one time we're told that the army deserts Saul. He's left with 600 men. Probably that's historically accurate, that 600 men would have been a considerable army in those days. The usual figures we're given in the Bible are massively exaggerated. As I've said before, you couldn't have an army of 40,000 men in the field simply because there wouldn't have been the capacity in those days to feed, clothe, and look after such a large body of men. There are some very interesting historical facts in this rather confused narrative. For example, look at chapter 13, verses 19 to 22. The Philistines are oppressing Israel. Well, yes, we've heard that. How are they oppressing Israel? The Philistines have monopolized metalwork. The Israelites have no access to blacksmiths or metal workers. Therefore, they have no weapons, and therefore they have no tools for ploughing the earth. Therefore, the Israelites are kept in a economically subservient condition by the Philistines, and they have to go to the Philistines to sharpen all their tools. So the Philistines are economic oppressors of the Israelites, and we assume from this that the Philistines are more advanced technologically than the Israelites. So it says that we do not want the Hebrews making spears, swords, or spears. Hence, the Israelites are all in the habit of going down individually to the Philistines to sharpen their plowshares, etc. The price was 2/3 of a shekel. Well, and they were even given the price there. So we get an astonishing insight, almost by accident, into the economic conditions of a very long time ago, 4,000 years ago. No, 3,000 years ago. Now, then, of course, we have this attack by Jonathan and so on. One of the things that comes up time and again in these chapters is the idea of the ritual fault. Samuel is supposed to come along and offer sacrifice after 7 days. He fails to turn up. The men start deserting. So Saul offers a sacrifice, and Saul is condemned for this. Now, this seems most unfair because King Solomon offers sacrifices in the temple later on. And what's wrong with the king offering a sacrifice? After all, the king's not a priest, but neither is Samuel a priest. And the king has a priest with him, it turns out. Later on, Saul says nobody is to eat anything, and Jonathan eats some honey as he's going through a field because nobody's told him about this ban on food. And then later, Jonathan should be condemned to death for this, but he's sort of let off because they pay a ransom. Again, it seems most ridiculous and unfair that somebody who doesn't know of a vow that somebody else has made should be held accountable for it. And then, of course, the people slaughter the Philistines' cattle after they've driven the Philistines out, and they eat the cattle there and then, including eating the blood. And this is a very bad thing as well. So we get this idea of the ritual fault. That's to say, something you do that's wrong, but it's wrong because it's not wrong in itself. It's wrong because God has said it's wrong. And for us Christians, that doesn't really cut the mustard. When we do things that are wrong, we do them because they're wrong in themselves. So, for example, if you commit adultery, adultery is wrong in itself. It's not just wrong simply because God has told you it's wrong. It's wrong in itself. Eating a bit of honey is not wrong in itself. Doing a sacrifice because the prophet doesn't turn up in time, it's not wrong in itself. It seems reasonable. And also, eating blood is not wrong in itself. It's been banned by God, but for us, it's not wrong in itself. If you have a black pudding, that's not sinful. Okay, so this idea of the ritual fault seems very, very strange to us. And as we'll see later on, Saul falls foul of the Lord for a ritual fault. We've already had him fall foul of Samuel again, and that's repeated. We constantly get this. But so Saul's fault is that he's not a very strict follower of the law, seems to be the implication. But Saul has some good qualities, because listen to this, right at the end of chapter 14. Saul consolidated his rule over Israel and made war on all his enemies on all fronts. On Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the king of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he was victorious. Now, this is what a king's supposed to do. So he's a great king, isn't he? He did great deeds of valor, the Bible tells us. He defeated the Amalekites and delivered Israel from those who used to pillage them. So, in other words, Saul is a wonderful king. He did deeds of great valor. And though, of course, whoever's writing this, at the same time, they include this praise of Saul, but they also include a great deal of dispraise of Saul. He is the man who breaks the law. But he's a man who breaks the law, and laws which seem to us at least quite unreasonable. This is what makes Saul a tragic character, and I think also makes Saul one of the most admirable and likable characters in the Old Testament, in my humble opinion. It tells us who Saul's sons were: Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchishua, and two daughters. He has two daughters who are Merab and Mishal. He only has 5 children, and he only seems to have one wife, which is interesting. She's Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. And then, of course, Abner, the son of Ner, is Saul's commander of the army and Saul's first cousin. Kish is Saul's father, Ner, the father of Abner. These were their brothers. And then we get this nice little bit here, which has obviously crept into the text somehow or another, but again, great historicity to this bit. There was fierce warfare with the Philistines throughout Saul's life. And that does ring true, because one of the things that you notice about ancient history is that it was endless war. The Greek states were always at war. The Roman Empire was always at war. The Romans and the Persians were at war constantly, except I think for one period of about 30 years when they had a truce. War was the rule of the day. War was what went on. Any strong or valiant man who caught Saul's eye, he recruited into his service. So Saul is the first person in the history of Israel who has a standing army. He is the man. Therefore, this means how big this standing army was, we don't know, because usually, as we've seen before, you call out the clans when you've got an emergency. But now he's got a standing army. Maybe this standing army was 500 men. But that means that Saul was the first king of Israel who organized the state so as to support a standing army. Because if you've got a standing army, it means you have a pay corps, it means you have a corps of cooks, it means you have a corps of administrators, and it means that you have a whole load of people who organize things and so on. You have an officer corps and so on and so forth. So Saul, I can't really say that Saul is the first founder of a modern state. It's not a modern state. But Saul is a founder, if you like, of an embryonic state. And this, I think, is interesting. I find history extremely interesting, and I find these history books absolutely fascinating. Saul comes out of these 2 chapters as a really good chap, in my humble opinion, and the people of God, if you like, the people, Samuel comes out of it as rather a dyspeptic old codger who's not very nice. And the law of God comes out of this as something totally unreasonable. So it's rather interesting. I'm reading it in a totally different way to, I'm sure, the way a rabbi would read it. It's very interesting historically. We need to know history. It's so interesting of itself. And yet also, let's remember that quite often the Book of the Kings and the Book of Samuel are dismissed as, quote, blood-curdling military history, unquote. Yes, there is quite a lot of that in those 2 chapters, but there's also a lot of other history as well, and a lot of personal history. This thing about the swords and the plowshares and the economic dominance of the Philistines, and also about Saul's family. He only had one wife. I wonder if they were happily married. My guess is, yes, they were. And they were a happy family. And Saul was always fighting wars and so on and so forth. When he came home to his wife and 5 children, I'm sure they were glad to see him. And we'll hear more, of course, about those sons later on, particularly the eldest one. All the very best. Thanks for listening. Bye.